It all started on a quiet Sunday evening, the kind where everything feels peaceful, almost too peaceful. I was in the kitchen, finishing up the dishes, when my stepson, Jake, walked in. He looked different. His usual confident, carefree expression replaced with something heavier, something hesitant. I could tell right away that something was on his mind. "Hey, can we talk?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. I dried my hands and turned to face him. "Of course. What's up?" He hesitated for a moment, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, like he was debating whether to say what he had come to say. That's when I knew this wasn't going to be just another casual conversation. My heart started to race a little. Jake had always been a good kid, responsible and independent. But he wasn't the type to open up easily. If he was about to share something, it had to be serious. He took a deep breath, his eyes darting around the room before finally meeting mine. "I need to tell you something, but I don't know how you're going to react." 1,000 possibilities ran through my mind in that split second. Was he in trouble? Did something happen at school? Was he struggling with something he couldn't handle alone? I could feel the weight of the moment settling between us, and I knew I had to handle it carefully. "Whatever it is, Jake, I'm here for you," I assured him, trying to keep my voice calm. "You can tell me anything." Jake exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck like he was gathering the last bit of courage he had left. Then, finally, he spoke. The words that followed changed everything. I stood there, frozen, as the reality of what he had just said sank in. My mind tried to process it, to understand what it meant for our family, for him, for me. The weight of his secret felt like it had shifted from his shoulders onto mine, and suddenly, nothing about our life felt the same anymore. And just like that, in a matter of seconds, our family dynamic shifted in a way I never saw coming. Jake's words hung in the air between us, heavy and unshakable. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he was bracing himself, like he expected me to react badly. But I couldn't. I was still trying to process what he had just told me. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. What was I supposed to say? A million questions swirled in my mind, but none of them seemed right. Instead, I focused on him, his expression, his body language. He looked relieved, like finally getting this secret off his chest had lifted a weight he had been carrying for a long time. I I started, then stopped. I took a deep breath. "Jake, I didn't see this coming." His eyes flickered with something, fear, disappointment, maybe both. He nodded slowly, looking down at the floor. "I know. That's why I didn't say anything before. I didn't know how you'd take it." I hated that. I hated that he had been carrying this alone, afraid of how I would react. I had been in his life for years, not just as a stepfather, but as someone who truly cared for him. And yet, he still doubted whether I would understand. That hurt more than anything. "I'm not mad," I said finally, my voice softer now. I need to understand." Jake sighed, rubbing his hands together like he was working up the courage to continue. "I didn't plan to tell you. I thought I could just keep going like everything's normal, but I couldn't. It's been eating me up inside." I nodded, encouraging him to keep going. "How long have you felt this way?" "A while," he admitted. I tried to push it down, pretend it wasn't a big deal. But it is, and I can't ignore it anymore. I could feel the weight of his words pressing down on both of us. Whatever this was, whatever secret he had kept hidden for so long, it mattered to him more than anything. "Have you told anyone else?" I asked gently. He shook his head. "You're the first." That hit me hard. He had trusted me enough to share this when he hadn't told anyone else. That meant something. But it also meant that whatever came next, whatever this secret meant for his future, for our family, I had to handle it the right way. And in that moment, I wasn't sure if I was ready for what came next. A heavy silence filled the room as I tried to piece together everything Jake had just told me. My mind raced with questions, but I didn't want to overwhelm him. He had finally opened up, and the last thing I wanted was to push him away. Jake shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the door like he was debating whether to leave. I could tell this wasn't easy for him. Whatever he was going through, it had taken him a lot of courage to say it out loud. I just. He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. I don't know what to do now. That hit me harder than I expected. He wasn't just telling me a secret, he was asking for help, even if he didn't say it directly. I wanted to say the right thing, to let him know that no matter what, he wasn't alone in this. But before I could, I heard the front door creak open. My wife, Jake's mom, had just gotten home. Her keys jingled as she set them on the counter, and she walked into the kitchen, stopping when she saw the look on our faces. "What's going on?" she asked, glancing between us. Jake tensed immediately. His posture changed, his expression unreadable. I could feel the shift in energy. He wasn't ready to tell her yet. Not now, maybe not ever. "Just talking," I said quickly, hoping she wouldn't push for more. She gave us a curious look, but didn't question it. "All right. Well, dinner's in an hour," she said, before walking toward the hallway. As soon as she was out of sight, Jake let out a slow breath, his shoulders dropping slightly. "You're not going to tell her, are you?" he asked, his voice quieter now. I shook my head. "That's not my choice to make, Jake. Whenever you're ready, if you're ever ready, you should be the one to do it." He nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. "I don't know if I can." I wanted to tell him that everything would be okay, that things would work themselves out, but the truth was, I didn't know that. And from the way Jake looked at me, I could tell he didn't believe it either. Whatever happened next, this wasn't going to be easy. Not for him, not for me, not for our family. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the conversation with Jake, analyzing every word, every pause, every unspoken thought behind his eyes. His secret was still sinking in, and I had no idea how to handle it. I wanted to be there for him, to support him, but I also knew this wasn't something I could fix with a few reassuring words. This was bigger. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of the house, my wife shifting in bed, the wind outside, the distant hum of a passing car. Everything felt normal, but nothing was normal anymore. The next morning, Jake barely spoke during breakfast. He kept his head down, poking at his food, lost in his own thoughts. My wife noticed. "Jake, are you feeling okay?" she asked, concern in her voice. He hesitated, then nodded quickly. "Yeah, just tired." She gave him a long look, like she didn't quite believe him, but she let it go. I could tell he was trying to act normal, but it wasn't working. The weight of what he had shared with me was pressing down on him, and now that I knew, I could feel it too. Later that day, I found him sitting on the back porch, staring out into the yard. I hesitated for a moment before stepping outside and sitting next to him. He didn't say anything at first. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken thoughts. "I keep thinking about what happens next," he finally said. His voice was quiet, almost lost in the breeze. "What if I made a mistake telling you?" His words hit me like a punch to the gut. He wasn't just afraid of the secret itself. He was afraid of what it meant for the future, for our family, for him. "You didn't make a mistake, Jake," I said firmly. "No matter what happens, I'm glad you told me." He sighed, rubbing his hands together. I just don't know how long I can keep this from Mom. It's getting harder. I nodded, understanding his struggle. Then maybe it's time to think about telling her. He turned to look at me, his eyes filled with uncertainty. And what if she doesn't take it well? I didn't have an answer for that, and that was the scariest part. Jake's question lingered in the air, thick with uncertainty. I wanted to tell him that everything would be fine, that his mom would understand, that our family wouldn't change. But I couldn't promise that. Not because I doubted her love for him, but because I knew how unpredictable moments like these could be. Sometimes, even the people we love the most don't react the way we expect. Jake exhaled sharply and stood up, running a hand through his hair. I need some air, he muttered, stepping off the porch and walking toward the driveway. I let him go, knowing he needed space, but something about his sudden need to leave unsettled me. He wasn't just taking a breather, he was avoiding something, maybe even himself. A few minutes later, I heard the front door open. My wife peeked outside, her eyes scanning the yard. Where's Jake? He just went for a walk, I said carefully. She frowned. Is he okay? He's been acting strange lately. I hesitated. He's got a lot on his mind. She sighed, leaning against the doorframe. I feel like I hardly talk to him anymore. He used to tell me everything. The guilt pressed down on me. I wanted to tell her the truth, but it wasn't my story to share. Before I could say anything, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, and I watched as her expression changed. First confusion, then something much worse. Without a word, she stepped inside, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. I followed, feeling my chest tighten. What's wrong? She didn't answer right away. Her eyes stayed locked on her phone, her face growing paler by the second. Then she whispered, Jake. I moved closer and glanced at the screen. It was a message, no, several messages, from someone I didn't recognize. But what caught my attention was the way they were written. Desperate, urgent. And then I saw Jake's name. What is this? I asked. She looked at me, her hands trembling slightly. I don't know, but I need to find him. Before I could respond, she grabbed her keys and rushed out the door. My heart pounded as I followed. Something was wrong, and whatever it was, it had just changed everything. We drove around the neighborhood, scanning the streets. My wife kept checking her phone, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Then, just as we turned a corner, she gasped. There he is! Jake was standing near a parked car, talking to someone. But it wasn't just anyone. It was a man. Older, unfamiliar, and from the way Jake was standing, he looked uneasy. Without thinking, my wife pulled over and jumped out of the car. Jake! He turned, startled, and so did the man. For a brief second, no one moved. Then, as if realizing he had been caught in something he wasn't supposed to be part of, the man quickly got into his car and drove off. Jake looked at us, his face pale, his hands clenched into fists. Why are you here? He asked, his voice sharp. I glanced at my wife, who was still breathing heavily from the rush of panic. Then I turned back to Jake. The real question is, who is that? His silence was louder than any answer he could have given. And in that moment, I knew. His secret wasn't the only thing he had been hiding. Jake's eyes darted between us and the road where the man had just disappeared. His body was tense, his breathing uneven. I could tell he was debating whether to speak or keep running from whatever this was. Jake, my wife said, her voice softer now, though still laced with worry. Who was that? He swallowed hard, looking away. It's complicated. That's not an answer, I said, stepping closer. Jake, we're trying to help you. He let out a shaky breath, rubbing his temples like he was trying to piece together the right words. Then, finally, he spoke. That man. He's my father. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. My wife's face drained of color. Jake, that's not possible. Your father. He left when you were little. He never tried to contact us. Jake nodded, his jaw clenched. I know. That's what I thought too. But a few months ago, he found me. He messaged me online, said he regretted everything, that he wanted to see me. My wife took a step back, shaking her head. And you believed him? Jake's expression hardened. I didn't at first, but I had to know. I had to hear him out. He told me he'd changed, that he wanted to be in my life. I exhaled slowly, trying to keep my emotions in check. So why didn't you tell us? Because I knew you'd try to stop me, he admitted, and maybe you should have. His voice cracked on the last words, and for the first time I saw the fear in his eyes. Whatever happened between them, it hadn't gone the way Jake expected. He wanted money, Jake finally said. That's all it was. He fed me stories, made me believe he actually cared, and then he asked for money, and when I told him I didn't have any, he got angry. A cold dread settled over me. Did he threaten you? Jake hesitated before nodding. My wife covered her mouth, her eyes welling with tears. That's why I've been acting different, Jake continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know what to do. I was scared he'd come after me. Or after you. I took a deep breath, my mind racing. He won't. We won't let him. Jake looked at me, searching my face for certainty. What if he doesn't stop? Before I could answer, my wife's phone buzzed again. Another message. And when she looked at it, her expression turned to sheer panic. He's not going to stop, she whispered. He's already outside our house. The room felt colder as my wife's words sank in. Jake froze, his eyes widening in fear. I didn't waste a second. Grabbing my phone, I stepped forward, my heart pounding. We're calling the police, now. Jake hesitated. But no buts. I cut him off firmly. He doesn't get to threaten you. He doesn't get to come near this family again. My wife was already dialing, her hands shaking. Jake looked toward the window, like he expected to see his father standing there. I put a hand on his shoulder. You're not alone in this, I said. We're in this together. He nodded, though I could see the emotions still battling inside him. For so long, he had carried this weight alone, afraid to tell us, afraid to face what it all meant. But now, it wasn't just his burden anymore. Minutes later, the police arrived. By the time we stepped outside, the man was already gone. The officers assured us they would look into it, and after giving them the messages and details, we had done all we could. Jake sat on the couch, his hands clasped together, staring at the floor. I really thought maybe he'd changed, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to believe it. I sat beside him. It's not wrong to hope, Jake, but some people, they don't deserve a second chance. He exhaled slowly, nodding. I feel so stupid. You're not stupid, my wife said, sitting on his other side. You're human, and you wanted something that any kid would want, to know your father cared. But that doesn't mean you did anything wrong. Jake didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, finally, he let out a shaky breath and leaned back against the couch. I guess I just have to let him go. And in that moment, I saw it. The weight lifting from him, the fear loosening its grip. This wasn't just about the danger or the threats. It was about Jake realizing that he wasn't tied to his past anymore. He had a family that loved him, that stood by him, no matter what. We spent the rest of the night together, talking, reassuring him, making sure he knew he was safe. The fear would take time to fade, but one thing was certain. Jake wasn't alone, and he never would be.